In Canada, 600 or more emergency staff were unable to fix the passport crisis.
No path of digital transformation and digital improvement is straight.
I love that irony that you're building a system that means you don't have to go into the office, but to build it, you have to go into the office.
We had two major tests. One was Brexit and the other one was COVID.
Is the real problem that politicians don't get credit for preventing crises that never happen?
Don't boil the ocean. Don't try and do it all at once.
Welcome to the Functional Government Podcast. After spending weeks learning about Passport Canada's tumultuous history, I wanted to find out how other countries had tackled these issues. In the early 2000s, Ireland looked a lot like Canada. When applications and renewals spiked, lines formed around government buildings. Kids even showed up early to reserve spots in line and sell them to the highest bidder. Ireland started small. By allowing applicants to book a time, they got rid of queues. Building on this initial success, they tackled the bigger problem of online renewals. To fix this, they brought in a reform team that was able to work across the whole Department of Foreign Affairs. The result was unanimous praise, rapid adoption, and what Minister Charlie Flanagan called one of the most significant innovations in customer service in 15 years. It wasn't easy. It took political willpower, simple beginnings, and a tight focus on usability, but the results speak for themselves. In 2017, Irish adults could renew. In 2018, the service expanded to children and name changes, and in 2019, the system accepted first-time applicants validated by the local police station. We sat down with one of the architects that built the system for the Irish government, Professor of Practice at the University of Limerick, John Savage, to learn how it all went down. Hi, John. How are you?
I'm great, Alistair. Yourself?
Doing very well. Very curious to learn about how you've modernized the passport process in Ireland, something Canadians feel very strongly about. We've had some challenges with passport modernization here. And I know you helped build what is considered one of the world's most successful passport renewal and modernization platforms. But I understand this didn't really start with passports. It began with solving like a 4 to 6 hour queue in Dublin in 2012. So can you take us back to that and paint a picture of what citizens were facing at the time?
Absolutely. I think it's seen as the overnight success, but it took 10 years to get there, So yeah, like you go back historically, in Ireland, there was a summer ritual, which was the bad press around 4, 6, 8 hour queues at the passport office in Dublin. We had a system called Passport Express for years before that, where you could apply online, but you had to have at least 3 weeks before you traveled, and I think it was only for renewals. So the problem was anyone that did a last minute passport thing or getting a first passport had to physically go to Dublin, stand in line and join literally hundreds, if not thousands of others waiting for a ticket to go in and get their passport renewed at a bench. So I guess what happened was in 2012, we got involved in a project with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, as it was called then. It's just Department of Foreign Affairs today, so DFA. And the ask was, could we build a digital booking system? So the idea was to set up a scenario whereby members of the public cannot show up at the desk unless they have an assigned time by which to do so.
But let me understand, before this, were there people exploiting the system? Like, was it just people standing in line, or did you grab a number? Or how do you try to fix this in the analog world before you finally looked at digital?
Well, I guess, entrepreneurship is always encouraged, but sometimes there can be side effects to it. And there were stories I heard of young people who would head into the passport office very early in the morning and grab 20, 30, 40 tickets from the ticket machine, because you had to take a ticket, wait for your number to get called, and then they would go out and sell the low numbers to the highest bidder. It was a funny story every so often that you were able to purchase a ticket to get ahead of the queue. By and large, it was very long wait times, and I'm sad to report that the success of the booking system we built resulted in the end of those entrepreneurial careers. But I'm sure they found other things to spend their time on and to help society out with, for sure.
So you started out with just booking appointments.
Yes. So very simple. You put up a calendar of availability. You ask people what they want to do. Depending on what they want to do, is it a 5, 10, 20, half an hour slot required in a window? You make sure that all the breaks and whatnot are taken into consideration as well. So you have a manpower back end as well. But the result of it was the number of people who had to physically be on site went from hundreds, if not thousands, into peak time to tumbleweeds.
So you now have a system in 2012 where people can go online and reserve something.
Yes.
And that reduces the number of people that have to be there because you have a much more predictable customer load. What was the next thing that you built after that?
I guess once we put that in place, like 2012, 2013, there was a year or two of refinements and improvements on that. And kind of, started out with only one or two windows, and all of the hatches got brought on board. There was also always and still is a major concern about accessibility. So you can't build a government digital service that isn't available to everybody. And for this one in particular, that was actually solved with a fairly simple means. Was there was a couple of free kiosks made available at the entrance to the building as well. So they had, essentially a simplified version of the system available that allow you to get a booking at last minute there. So there were some appointments had to be reserved in our system for the last minute booking. Otherwise, you'd show up and you wouldn't get an appointment for 2 weeks, which physically wouldn't work.
That's an interesting, like, I love these ideas of, you have a challenge like accessibility, which is a very valid concern. But instead of saying, therefore, we can't modernize, you say, how do we modernize that part of things as well? And in your case, the compromise solution was to set aside some amount of same day approvals and then have a kiosk with a device in case the person didn't have access to a device.
Yep. And it even went so far as the security guards at the entrance were able to help those that were not digitally literate to go ahead and get the appointment as well. So yeah, I think no path of digital transformation and digital improvement is straight. There's always unforeseen circumstances or unforeseen problems, and the naysayers will latch on them to pull a handbrake. But I think, when you know what your product is, you know what your process is, you know what your target audience is, well, then you will find a way by which you can solve it and still keep the essence of what you're trying to achieve in flight.
So once you've got the system working and you've tweaked some of the things a little bit, what was the next digital sort of enhancement you put into the process?
Yeah, it's about 2 years later, I think we won a tender, and it was to do with the passport appointments booking. So it was our first kind of touch on passports themselves. It was the passport tracker. So we built a system that essentially surfaced up for the members of the public, or we refreshed the system that was there, that allowed a member of the public who'd applied for a passport to see where their passport was in the process. So it kind of gave you an idea of what your status was, what your estimated remaining time was in the process, when it was last seen by a human or went through a step in a process, was rejected or not. So all of that was like a public system that we built. And there was one or two other smaller systems we built along with that. The other one I'll reference is the citizens registration. So a key aspect of foreign affairs is, your citizens can go to trouble spots, for example. So places with travel advisories, you might want people to register before they go there, so that should something bad happen, you know where they are and how to contact them. So, citizens registration was something we did as part of that same kind of digital refresh. So what you'll see is the pattern is that they're kind of taking peripheral services that are non-core, but they're still important aspects of the business, and moving them away from, people filling in a form and submitting it. So sometimes it's referred to as digital paper, but the idea is to identify various processes that are non-core. So if they do go wrong, they're not going to disrupt your business massively or your process massively. And yeah, as I said, the booking system and citizens registration were the next two that we took on in like 15.
So did people notice as a result of the tracking, did that build sort of public awareness of delays in the process? I mean, now people can see what's going on.
Yeah, no, I think the expectation might have been improved. There was a massive step forward with the booking system. There was a lot of public awareness of the booking system. The passport tracker was a little bit lower under the radar. It was more a refresh of what was already there. But I think the appetite for faster turnaround and the expectation of faster turnaround was whetted with the booking system, and then the tracker just, I guess, allowed people to see easier how long things were taking, and maybe it increased frustration. But I don't remember it being a major thing in the media at the time, no.
So the next step was renewals themselves, right? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so then the big time hit, I guess, so 2015, a major tender came out for the online passport service. That was what the tender was put out as. And the company I was with at the time, Action Point, we won that tender, and we worked very closely with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to deliver that system. What was the system? Well, Passport Online was everything to do with passports online is what the system's ultimately meant to support. But in order to avoid boiling the ocean and make sure that things are done stepwise, because whatever we were changing, there was a huge amount of internal change required for it. What we did for the very first release, which was Patrick's Day, the Day of Diplomacy for Ireland, Patrick's Day 2017 is when it was launched. And essentially on that day, you as an adult could renew your passport online. So from a passport security perspective, an adult that's renewing, by definition, you already have their biometrics in your system. You're already validated. You know they're a citizen. You know their identity is safe and secure. You're renewing it. So it was like the lowest bar. It's still highly secure, highly sensitive, and so on.
When you say lowest bar, you mean specifically renewals for adults, both. Yes. Adults, you have their consent legally, and renewals, meaning you already know who they are. And that was the low-hanging fruit, or the sort of minimum viable product for passports.
Yeah. So from a process complexity, when I say lowest bar, from a process complexity perspective, that was probably the simplest passport type of issuance, essentially.
But it was still very complex. As you said, there's a bunch of internal stuff. I know you weren't part of the government and you're not a public servant. Can you speak to the kinds of changes the government had to make internally in order to support this process with digital front end?
One of the things was with software projects, it never really happened with ours, but I hear in the world of software projects, sometimes they can run late. So when dates get challenged, within the part of the process we were delivering, we were reminded 1,000 times over that what we were changing was literally 10 to 20% of what the overall process change is. So their internal systems for managing the security, the whole history of all passports ever issued, the connections with foreign governments, there are unbelievable levels of complexity in that. Not to mention, you've got all sorts of staff retraining. So a large amount of people who would have been opening letters coming in by the Passport Express and physically parsing and typing in data from those forms now need to be retrained to manage the different problems that come with a digital platform. So yeah, certainly the whole thing, and the thing that I think the department really got really right, was they had what's called a reform team. So reform team, again, never part of it, but we worked, they were our bosses on this project delivery. But the reform team, from what I could see, was essentially like a cross-cutting concern. They could carry out digital reform programs and process reform programs across the department. They weren't necessarily in one silo of what the department did. They were kind of cross-cutting to bring efficiencies across the department. And essentially, passports online was one of their major projects over the years.
So they were across all of government, but this was a passport thing, or were they all across the passport?
No, across just the department. So the Department of Foreign Affairs had a reform team, but the department has got a very broad remit. So
there was no government-wide reform team. There was one within.
I think various departments have brought in the same model. There's the OGCIO, Office of Government Chief Information Officer. It's a mouthful. I'm sorry, but the OGCIO was trying to bring in that across the government, but the reform team, I think, has predated that by quite a bit, and they're the ones we were exposed to, so they're the ones I can speak most specifically about. Yeah.
So Charlie Flanagan, one of your ministers in 2017, said that this was one of the most significant innovations in customer service that the department had seen in the previous 15 years. It sounds like it was, by almost all accounts, a very good deliverable that people liked and that people were tangibly aware of. Passports are a great example of something that are, when you need them, you really need them. Most citizens are entitled to one. It's something that's clearly controlled by the nation, not the city or the province or the state. Was there a reason why passports was something that got the political will and the focus to actually make this change?
That's a good question. I think it's just the desire to do better. From the outside, I wasn't involved in internal policy prioritization conversations, let's say. But I think there was kind of a groundswell of digital activity, certainly growing at that point in time. And I think the key thing of digitizing a process is if you don't know what your process to begin with, you're going to digitize absolute garbage. So in essence, what we had in the passport system is a very, very well-defined public interface with the Passport Express. So, the first discussion about it was, what's the process Passport Express does and how do we improve that and digitize that? So a very strong public interface was something that helped streamline it. And also, as you mentioned, high impact. The trouble you have is you often think of passports in terms of your local citizens, but you've got a huge diaspora. Ireland in particular has a very large diaspora. So enabling the diaspora to get their passport services from all around the world is something that was exceptionally painful, with trips home in the worst case scenario, but trips maybe to other countries, to an embassy to pick up your passport and so on. All of that was quite a painful process that was time consuming and costly for everybody involved. So finding a way to streamline it was something that I think, there was enough use cases and the process was well defined enough that I think it was I won't say low risk, but it was an acceptable risk for the political backing to jump in behind it.
Those are great insights that you really want to make sure that the the process was well defined, even in the physical world, and that it
Yeah.
is a situation where digital will provide tremendous advantage, not just incremental advantage, such as people in other countries and not having embassies nearby and things like that. The biometric requirements for passports, photos, fingerprints, signatures, they're inherently physical things. Was there some kind of breakthrough that let you handle them digitally while maintaining a security that was needed for that kind of thing?
That's one. So we would have been involved only on the periphery. So there was a company, let's say, called PhotoMe that ran the photo booths in Ireland, and they ended up building an API that we could tap into to pull. So if you go into a photo booth and take a photograph, we can get a digital copy of it. You're not using the physical printed of your photograph at all. But then when we uploaded a photograph, or we allowed a photograph to be uploaded into the system, the biometric checking and all that was done by third-party specialists. So as far as we were concerned, our APIs we passed stuff into, and we got a yes or no back from them. So the breakthroughs, the cryptographic stuff, the actual security of it is something that I really can't speak to, unfortunately. But I think we did speak with other countries about the biometrics they use, and some of them use fingerprints, whereas in Ireland, I believe the biometrics is primarily the facial shape and the facial structure. So you can get that from a photograph, whereas in countries where the fingerprints are deemed to be the biometric, measure that you got to hit, well, now all of a sudden you've got a big barrier because you have to physically fingerprint someone. You can't take a picture of your fingerprints. We did explore that in one of the countries we spoke to, but it's just not reliable enough at scale. So, yeah, I think it's a country by country decision as to what biometrics they use. And I think those that are on the facial only will find it much easier to digitize their passport processes.
I know one of the advantages of rapid prototyping is the ability to use cloud infrastructure and on-demand compute. But obviously, when you're dealing with data sovereignty like this, there are a lot of constraints on that. How much of this did you have to use government-owned infrastructure for?
About 99.999% of it. We're allowed to develop on our own infrastructure, and that was about it. As far as data security goes and everything else, it was exceptionally and still is exceptionally tight. It is all an on-prem data center somewhere in Ireland that I won't name. And in essence, for us to do any deployment for the first year or two, we had to actually physically go into another Department of Foreign Affairs office that was near our business premises. So, you had to physically be in a DFA building in order to be able to access the infrastructure. That's the way it was. And then COVID hits, which luckily brought in other processes. So we were able to do remote connections in, but it was under severe security, a DFA issued laptop oversight and so on. So yeah, the level of security in the system is top notch.
I love that irony that you're building a system that means you don't have to go into the office, but to build it, you have to go into the office. You got 100% positive media sentiment from public surveys in the media coverage. Like, that's astonishing. That's, I would say, almost unprecedented. There's always someone who's complaining about what you've done. What do you think made the difference?
It was mind blowing. So we were never given the CSFs, the critical success factors, or the KPIs, the key performance indicators that we were being measured against, or the systems measured against. We never had insight into what was set out as the benchmark, but all we know is that within a couple of months, we were told 1,000 times over that everything that was laid out as a target to hit from a satisfaction perspective was blown away. Like, the adoption rate was second to none, phenomenal. You're talking doubling, month over month. I think there were two key aspects to the system. One is the usability, and that's one that we'll maybe lay claim to. Now, an awful lot of support from the DFA, but the initial design of the system and how the users actually go through it was really, really, really well thought out. The mandate was 18 to 80. So, we had to be able to have someone from 18 years old to 80 years and, both sides and all the rest. But we couldn't assume, it's always on a mobile. We couldn't assume anything. It had to be fully usable. And in essence, we did a lot of user testing on it, even just straightforward pieces of paper, prototyping, to get the usability as strong as possible before we started building out the system, breaking down a big, long, complex paper form into literally single point questions. What is your first name? What is your second name? What is your age? So I've been very, very specific in bringing people through the process, because ultimately what we wanted to do is minimize the rejection rate. So we wanted to have as much validation of the process as you're going through the process as possible, so that by the time you get to the point of submission, there's really nowhere that you could have gone wrong. That was kind of what the idea was. And by doing so in a very clear way where people were well informed as they went, I think that was just a phenomenal experience. And people were seeing this and comparing it back to when they were last in Molesworth Street and kind of queuing up for 6 hours and buying a ticket from some young fella. And they thought it was, a huge improvement. So I think that was
So yeah,
the first, for
clear
sure.
understanding that everyone's suffered in the past, I guess, is a good way to do well. So
Yeah.
you talked about the evolution here: bookings in 2012, tracking in 2015, adult renewals in 2017. When did you get to the more sensitive things like children's passports and so on? What was the next step there?
Well, I think once the success was seen and proven, things move fairly rapidly. Now, rapidly, but it's still a big system. So it's basically once a year we kind of had another major release. That was kind of the plan. And, the things with passports as well is there's a lot of seasonality around them. So you don't really want to do a release in July. That's not a good idea. So, we had to make sure that we were, cognizant of when the business cycle was in planning out when your various releases are. But so as I said, we launched originally in 2017. That was adult renewals only. Then in 18, we added child renewals. So again, renewal is the key thing because you already have the biometric information. So your process is fairly streamlined, but with children, there's a lot of sensitivity around, someone getting a passport for their child, not informing the other parent. And next thing, there's a problem. So child renewals was done in 2018. So there's a few more checks and balances in that for sure, along with name change and observation. So an observation on your passport is my maiden name was. So as if you're traveling with your children and there's a different surname, it's still, no questions at borders and so on. Then, in 2019, that was when we went and we bit the bullet and did the first-time applicants. And first-time applicants adds an awful lot more from a complexity and paperwork perspective because, the state does not know your identity yet. So digitally, can we track your identity or can we get your identity validated via the process? And in essence, what we did there was there's kind of almost a two-step process where you apply, you fill in the forms, but then you get emailed the form that you print out. Then you got to go to a local Garda station. So police, Garda Síochána or the Irish Police Force. So you got to go to a local Garda station and get a Garda that hopefully knows you to sign and say, yes, you are indeed this person, bringing with you utility bill, other issued photo ID and so on. And then once that's signed and then put back in, then off it goes, it's then submitted. What I only found out years later was the Department of Foreign Affairs actually called that guard. So the guards put their number down. So the Department of Foreign Affairs call each guard that has signed every form and says, you signed for John Savage. Can you confirm on this date it was you? Like it's
so that's like for Canadians, the RCMP, our National Police Force.
National Police, yeah.
Getting a call every time they've signed for a passport. That's a lot of extra work. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the problem. So,
and honestly, they probably go, well, I sort of remember him. I mean, I did a made a favor kind of thing, as opposed to, genuine. I think we have the same thing where someone has to testify that you've been a Canadian and they've known you and stuff.
Yeah. Well, look, in Ireland, everyone knows everyone, so it's probably more straightforward. But yeah.
I notice that around March 2017, when you launched, that was when Brexit negotiations were beginning. And I know Ireland saw an unprecedented surge in passport applications from Northern Irish residents claiming Irish citizenship. Did that test the system? I mean, the timing is kind of fortuitous, but also it's a scaling challenge.
Yeah, no, we had two major tests. One was Brexit and the other one was COVID. Well, actually, post-COVID. Yeah, so the Brexit one is funny. There's a bit of, we always kind of, our local history is sometimes funny. So not only is it Northern Ireland, although a citizen of Northern Ireland can actually hold three passports. They can hold English, Irish, and American, which is very rare combination. Wow. But if you're living in England, Ireland has something called the grandmother rule. If you're living in England and you can prove that any of your grandparents were born in Ireland, you can claim Irish citizenship. So it helps our Irish soccer team, our national soccer team, is a lot of people from that sort of heritage. But what happened was when Brexit kicked in, kind of, I think 16, 17 is when it was voted in, 20 is when it became, physically a reality. So in the intervening years, people were realizing what they were going to lose as an EU citizen. And I'll even speak to our own personal situation. My co-founder in the Business Action Point, David Jeffries, was an English citizen. And the problem was we were then facing a situation where we would have a non-EU citizen as a board member of an Irish limited company, and that brings in all sorts of extra paperwork. So he was in this boat. What's the solution? Well, the solution is to try and get an Irish passport if you can at all. So the amount of people across England that applied for an Irish passport, and again, because of Ireland and England having such a close relationship over the years, not always friendly, but always close, then they could keep both. So it was kind of almost a zero jeopardy type situation. So we saw a huge influx of passports. I think we saw trebling between April and December 2018. It went from like 15,000 to 45,000 a month over the course of those couple of months. So it's kind of, that's a mid-time when people were realizing what the implication was. So huge jump. And yeah, that was kind of foreseen, but not so much. Whereas the COVID one, what we saw was a big pause for almost a year, 2 years. Not so much a big pause, but a massive drop in the amount of passports being required. And then suddenly, I think it was 22 when it kind of opened back up again. We issued 1.2 million passports, which was a record for Ireland. And when you do the maths on it, if you distribute it evenly, it's like 140 an hour over the course of 24 hours, 365. But reality is people apply for passports over the course of like 3 or 4 months. And in those 3 or 4 months, they're only working on passports probably for 6 hours a day. So in reality, there was periods of time where we were getting a new passport application per second for hours on end. So it was an extremely high utilization situation. But I don't think it could have been done as effectively with a manual workforce without seeing massive delays creeping into the system.
So before we get into Canada's challenges, of which there are many, I want to understand what the issues are with digital versus physical. So, you get low single-digit rejection rates for online applications. Obviously, that changes as people get more used to it. How does that compare to physical, and what are the reasons that applications get rejected?
Let me talk about a happy path for a second, and I can attest to this personally. So the happy path is, for me, December 2 years ago, my passport was up, and on a Thursday morning, before 11 o'clock, so 12 o'clock is kind of posted the cutoff, but before 11 o'clock, I went through the process online, renewed my passport, uploaded my photograph, entered all my details, and so on and so forth. And then what happened was the Friday morning, so the following morning, about 24 hours after I issued it, passport was in my postbox. So the happy path is within 8 to 10 minutes of you finishing the online process, if everything ticks and you fully match across the board with the biometrics on record, the address, the name, everything else, well, then your passport book is printed within about 10 minutes of the process completing online.
Wait. So let me get this straight. I take out my phone.
Yeah.
I fill in the fields on the app. I take a photo, not a selfie, but with the other side of the camera.
Yeah, you can do that.
And if everything,
but you can do that.
And if everything works, 10 to 12 minutes after I hit send, I get a message saying, "Here's your postage tracking number for your passport."
It'll take a bit longer. The passport tracker updates twice a day, so it'll take longer for technical reasons. But technically, your physical passport exists pretty quickly and will spend longer with the Irish Postal Service than it will with the Department of Foreign Affairs.
That's the soundbite right there.
Yeah. Now, by the way, I'll just say that the official timeline is still 7 days.
Sure.
But it's happy
and you said
path
this is the
things are going
happy
well.
path. I love this idea. Is that a term from design, or is that something you use?
Oh yeah, no, it's a design term. So it's a happy path is no exceptions, everything fine. Let's rock on. And then we talk about exceptions with causes of rejections.
So what's the miserable path?
The miserable path will be the most common one is you just said, I'll use the back of my phone. Don't use the back of your phone. Use the back of your phone. Your background isn't exactly white, or there's some shading on the background, or you're not centered on the screen, or you're actually smiling. Do not smile. You're not allowed. There are so many reasons that's not going to work. Classic one is kids, young children. You bring them to the pharmacy and they'll actually position you and take the picture and take multiple shots. If you put them in a photo booth, you drop in your €5. It doesn't work in the first 4 shots. You got to go again and again and again and again. So getting the photograph right is probably the most common rejection scenario. Then you have people have had medical issues and they no longer look the same as they looked before. Then your biometrics may not match up. Also just pure data entry stuff that happens. And then the other one then is oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes because of certain aspects of your passport application or your personal circumstances, they might need more supporting evidence. So let's say you put in a name change. Well, they might need your deed poll or your marriage certificate or whatever it is. So you'll get an email out saying, okay, we now need more information. Can you go to this portal and upload? So it's back to our system. So our system allows what's called resubmissions, which is further documentation to be added alongside. But what can happen is that time's out. So you didn't spot the email. It went to your junk. You didn't look at it. And next thing you're calling up saying, where's my passport? We're saying, well, we're waiting on you. And it gets stuck. So you get some go dead because people don't follow up. Photographs by far and away are the major one. And the strong recommendation is go to the photo booth or the pharmacist and get your picture there.
Looking at the current state, I mean, over 140 countries served, less than 2-day turnaround, 7-day guarantees, but usually pretty fast. What could still be improved?
That's a good question. I think I think like at the end of the day, the system was built like 8 years ago. So it works and it works really well, but there's a new kind of style idiom online and so on. So I think a full refresh of how the system works is something that is in the offing. I think that'd be welcome. It still works really well, but I think just a UI refresh would help. And I think then in the back end, there's always system refreshes going on. But I think from a user interface perspective, as in, what does the user do? How does the system work? I think it hit the mark. Like at the end of the day, a passport application needs X amount of information, and you can present that in 1,000 different ways, but it needs X amount of information. And what we have built is a system that's been online now for 7 or 8 years. A few issues over the years, but by and large online 24/7, and it works really well and has been really, really, really well received. So what can be improved? Well, there's probably going to be more people applying for passports every year as the country grows and as more people go on holidays. So it's kind of in the technical nitty-gritty of scale, reliability, redundancy, all that sort of stuff.
So how much do you know about Canada's passport system?
I hear it's great.
So we had a similar issue with COVID and so on. In Canada, processing times went from the usual 10 to 20 business days to over 10 weeks for mail applications. There were people lining up at 11 p.m. in order to get into the passport office the next morning. And after COVID, there was a huge surge in passport applications, nearly 100 times more. A huge amount of people standing in line in Vancouver. There were reports of people standing in line for $800. So I guess entrepreneurship is not all Irish. And it has relied on a very detailed sort of physical processing problem. And we've tried to address this in the past, but basically canceled any attempt to modernize and return to digital. One of the challenges is that we don't really have good standardized government ID. So there's no unified government ID because things at the federal level are sometimes government run, but we authenticate through a private bank. There's 60 different kinds of login to federal government. Driver's license and healthcare are handled at the provincial level and so on. How important was unified digital ID in making this possible?
Not at all. So in, I think, 2019, we added support for something called MyGovID, which is the closest thing Ireland has to digital ID, but it isn't like an RDAC card like in India. It's not like that level of digital ID. So essentially what we did with MyGovID was we allowed you at your first step of the passport, say, do you want to enter your MyGovID? And if you enter MyGovID, we can use that to extract what your validated name, address, date of birth, and so on is. And we just pre-populate the form for you. After that, we don't tie back to your MyGovID. So it's a very lightweight integration, let's say. But that was like the third or fourth release. But it wasn't required
to
No.
Just if you have it, then we'll pre-fill some information.
Yeah. And go back just to reiterate on the journey, if you look at if Canada could do an online adult renewal form because you've got the biometric history. From memory, there was a conversation with the department where they said one of the things that they had to allow happen was the old non-biometric passports had to pass out of circulation. So I don't remember when biometric passports were brought in, but that has to, if your passport life is 10 years, then you can't do it while any non-biometrics are still in place. Once you've got a history whereby the entirety of passports in issuance have a biometric, well, now validating the new one against the old one is a whole lot more straightforward. So yeah, I would assume at this stage that all your passports are biometric, in which case, doing the same thing that the Irish government does, don't boil the ocean, don't try and do it all at once. Take one process, it's the whole Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule. Probably 80% of the effort and 80% of the interactions are the 8 or 9 times you renew your passport, not the first time you apply for it. So why not just focus on that, get the low-hanging fruit, get that in place, and once that's working, then look to expand it, land and expand.
So you mentioned earlier on when we were chatting about this beforehand, this concept you had of careful, continuous, and courageous as sort of a mindset for approaching these kinds of things. Yeah. Can you talk a little about what those 3 attributes are and why they deliver good digital results?
When you're in the public sector, public perception and getting it right is number one. You can't put something out there that doesn't work. You simply can't. In Ireland, there's a media personality called Joe Duffy, and everyone in the civil service refers to a Joe Duffy moment, which is, you end up being the person being called by Joe Duffy because your service has caused some issue and some public outrage. So nobody in the civil service wants a Joe Duffy moment at all.
Sounds like Rick Mercer in Canada.
I would assume as much. Yeah. So you don't want a Joe Duffy or Rick Mercer moment. So you've got to avoid that. So that's the careful part. Is you have to be careful. But then I'll jump to the courageous. But if you're careful the whole time, you're never going to take any risk. So you've got to make sure, and you take a small risk, a measured risk, and you're courageous, and you stand over that, and you push the boat out, and you take a chance, but not an unmeasured, irrational risk. It has to be, hold on a second, going back to the Irish story, Passport Express is well established, the process is well established, the existing passports are already all in a database, we have all the biometrics, we can validate it. It's almost like you go through and you break it down, and you courageously take a step forward. And once you decide to move forward, don't try and take one big leap. Don't boil the ocean. Aim for continuous improvement and basically have a 3, 5, 10, 15-year plan where every year or two you're adding more and you're making another constituency happy. So if you take it one constituent at a time, adult renewals, let's say, as we said in Ireland was the process, then you're making that constituent happy. And once they're happy and now they're talking about how great it is, now the next ones who mightn't be as comfortable are saying, well, actually, maybe we might. And you're slowly but surely moving a needle on public perception. I have to say the passport system was embraced from the very, very start. But, once it was launched, it was one of those few software systems I built over the years. Normally it's internal business process automation that nobody outside the company ever knows about. This one, like my mother's like, this is amazing. It's brilliant. So it touched every corner of society. And so the reward is there, but it needs leadership that have that digital idea to take those courageous, continuous steps, but being careful as well and not jeopardizing it. Because if that first step goes wrong, you're not going to get step 2. So the first step and finding the right partner for that first step is very important.
I mean, it really does seem like you're doing the sort of minimum viable product thinking here, where you say,
Yep.
First we'll do the queues, then we'll do the tracking, then we'll do adult renewals. And then by the time you get to more sensitive things like first passports for children, you're able to, for example, hook into the underlying databases of birth registries and things like that. And there's more political will to do so.
With all change, at the start is a push, and someone has to be, the guy pushing the rock up the hill. But once you get it up the hill and the adoption is clear, you're suddenly having to put the brakes on because it's like, oh, can we do this? Can we do this? Can we do this? And you're like, whoa, hold on a second. Let's remember, careful. We got to be careful the whole time. But the momentum builds and the demand builds, and it goes from a push to a pull, and that's the sweet spot. And when you see that happen in any part of any organization, it's a phenomenal thing to witness.
In Canada, 600 or more emergency staff were unable to fix the passport crisis that we faced. Ireland handled record demand with both the COVID spike and the Brexit spike. What does that tell you about trying to solve 21st century problems with 20th century staffing approaches?
A problem we had was during the COVID traceability side of things, a lot of civil service staff from across all of government were seconded over to do contact tracing. So then when a massive wave of passport renewals hit, when the 2 years of passports that nobody bought are renewed during COVID came in 22, the staff weren't there because they've been seconded. So there was a large challenge in getting it up running, but because the system was automated, all of the data could be brought in and as much of it renewed as possible. So I don't believe from an external perspective that the massive and sudden increase that was triggered by Brexit or that was triggered by the post-COVID holidays would have been manageable in a realistic term with manpower, because you would have had to have overnight trebled or quadrupled and trained up staff in a highly sensitive process. So I can see how the story of 600 staff, that becomes extremely difficult to manage. How do you do it?
I guess the real answer here is that scaling humans is hard.
Yeah, they're inherently unscalable and hard to bring in, and you've got a massive lead time, 3-6 months before anybody's proficient in a new role. So and when you're dealing with something like passports, you can't have people that are substandard doing the work. They have to be top notch all the time.
Well, I think when people say humans are hard to scale, you get a lot of criticism and pushback from public servants who worry about their job security. But what I liked about your earlier story was, well, now there's these 2 kiosks when you arrive, and there's people who now have time to help someone who's not technically savvy actually work through the process. It seems to me like we can get to a more humane form of government if we modernize the Pareto rule, the sort of 80-20 stuff that we shouldn't be wasting our time on.
It's not that the work goes away, so you start doing higher valued work. So, rather than data entering information from paper form into a system and that's your day for the day, you're now actually analyzing the information and making decisions and deciding yay or nay or driving the process on. So if you've got a cohort of people, those cohort of people almost always stay in place, but that cohort can achieve so much more when you bring in automation the right way.
So both of our government leaders called the passport situations unacceptable in their time. Trudeau said that the delays were unacceptable, but Irish ministers said that not being digital was unacceptable. It does seem to me like there's a very different focus on what's to blame. The outcome is to blame versus the cause is to blame. How critical is political will versus having just good technology?
Something like this would not have moved forward without political support. It had to come from the top. No amount of pulling or dragging or people, shouting at the desk or even the middle managers trying to make it happen could make it happen. It had to be something from top down would be my view in any country, any organization, because we would have spoken with people in the Philippines and in Nigeria as well about maybe helping them roll out a passport system as well. And they were in 19 and 20 and then COVID hit and that was the end of all foreign travel and those sorts of conversations. But with both of those, we went in essentially with the Irish ambassador to talk to the equivalent of Charlie Flanagan and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So we were talking at top level of government because talking at any other level, it just never was going to happen because you've got to make sure that the political will is there to drive it on. Absolutely, it's critical.
The audit of the Canadian passport system blamed decades of underinvestment in unsexy back-end infrastructure.
Yeah.
Is the real problem that politicians don't get credit for preventing crises that never happen?
It's so hard to prove a negative, isn't it? You just can't. So, you look back at the Millennium Bug. That's a classic one that the IT industry is still falling foul of today. How many billions were invested in avoiding an issue and then, hey, nothing happened. It's like, God has wasted money. Well, if you didn't spend it, the world could have blown up. You just don't know. So yeah, I think the back end investment, if you go to the Irish story, the reason we were able to do adult renewals out of the traps was because the authentication of who you were as a citizen was derived from what was stored in the back end systems. So if you didn't have any back-end systems, and if that was all still paper, you wouldn't have a hope with online digital. So I think that work, while it was termed unsexy, maybe it's a critical heavy lift to make sure that this works.
Well, John, thank you so much for spending time telling us about this. It's really nice to actually speak with someone who's got the proverbial dirt under their fingernails and hear this firsthand.
Thank you. Alistair, it's been fun.
Thanks for joining us on the Functional Government Podcast.